The rain tapped gently against the kitchen window as Helen Miller sat at her small dining table, staring at the pile of unpaid bills spread before her. 3 years had passed since her husband's death, and each month seemed to bring new financial challenges. The pension check barely covered rent and groceries, leaving little room for anything else. At 58, Helen found herself in a position she never imagined, struggling to make ends meet in the tiny apartment that had become her whole world. The silence in her home was deafening. Gone were the days when laughter filled these rooms, when her husband would hum while making coffee in the morning, or when her children would call multiple times a week. Now, the phone rarely rang, and when it did, it was usually someone trying to sell her something she couldn't afford. Her 2 adult children lived across the country, busy with their own families and careers. They called on holidays and birthdays, but the conversations always felt rushed, filled with polite questions about her health and promises to visit soon that never seemed to materialize. Helen folded the electric bill and placed it back in the envelope, her hands trembling slightly. She had already turned the heat down to save money, wearing sweaters indoors even as autumn settled over the neighborhood. The grocery budget had been cut to the bare minimum, and she found herself eating the same simple meals day after day. Pride had prevented her from asking her children for help, but she was beginning to wonder how much longer she could manage on her own. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Helen wasn't expecting anyone, and visitors were rare these days. She smoothed her gray hair and walked to the door, peering through the peephole to see her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, standing in the hallway with a concerned expression. "Hello?" "Dear," Mrs. Rodriguez said when Helen opened the door. "I hope I'm not bothering you. Do you have a moment to talk?" Helen invited her neighbor inside. Grateful for any human contact, Mrs. Rodriguez had been kind to her since her husband's passing, occasionally bringing homemade soup or checking in during bad weather. They sat in Helen's small living room, the furniture worn but clean, family photos lining the mantelpiece like silent witnesses to happier times. "I've been thinking about you lately," Mrs. Rodriguez began, accepting the cup of tea Helen offered. "I know these past few years have been difficult, and I wondered if you might be interested in some work. Nothing too demanding, just something that might help with expenses." Helen's eyes brightened with interest. She had looked for part-time jobs but found that most employers preferred younger workers. Her experience as a homemaker and mother didn't seem to count for much in the job market. "There's a man a few streets over," Mrs. Rodriguez continued. "His name is Michael, and he's raising 2 young children on his own. His wife passed away some months ago, and he's struggling terribly. The poor man works long hours and comes home to chaos every day. The children are having such a hard time, and he desperately needs help with cooking and looking after them." Mrs. Rodriguez paused to sip her tea, watching Helen's reaction carefully. "I mentioned you to my friend who knows the family. She said he's a good man, very respectful, but he's at his wit's end. The children barely eat proper meals, and he's exhausted trying to manage everything alone. I thought perhaps you might be able to help him a few days a week. Nothing too much, just cooking dinner, and maybe spending some time with the little ones." Helen felt a flutter of excitement mixed with nervousness. It had been years since she had cared for young children, but the maternal instincts never really disappeared. She remembered how much joy she had found in nurturing her own children, in creating warm meals and safe spaces for them to grow. "How old are the children?" Helen asked, already imagining the possibilities. "The girl is 7 and the boy is 4, Mrs. Rodriguez replied. "From what I hear, they're both struggling with their mother's death. The little boy has become quite difficult, and the girl has withdrawn completely. They need someone patient and caring, someone who understands what it means to create a loving home." The more Helen heard, the more interested she became. This wasn't just about earning money. It was about having purpose again, about using the skills she had developed over decades of homemaking and child-rearing. She had always been good with children, patient and nurturing by nature. Perhaps this was exactly what she needed, and what this family needed too. What kind of arrangement would he be looking for? Helen asked, trying to keep the hope out of her voice. "I'm not entirely sure about the details," Mrs. Rodriguez admitted. but I think he would be very reasonable about payment and scheduling. The address is 1247 Oak Street, just a 10-minute walk from here. If you're interested, you could simply go introduce yourself. I think you'd be perfect for this, Helen. You have so much love to give, and these children need exactly what you can offer. After Mrs. Rodriguez left, Helen couldn't stop thinking about the opportunity. She spent the evening imagining what it would be like to care for children again, to have little voices in her life and small hands to hold. The thought of preparing meals for a family, of being needed and useful again, filled her with more excitement than she had felt in years. The next morning, Helen took extra care getting ready. She chose her most presentable dress, styled her hair neatly, and practiced what she might say to introduce herself. Her heart pounded as she walked the familiar neighborhood streets toward Oak Street. The autumn air was crisp, and colorful leaves crunched under her feet as she made her way to number 1247. The house stood before her, a modest two-story home with a small front yard that clearly needed attention. Children's toys were scattered on the porch, and Helen could see through the front window that the living room was cluttered and disorganized. This family definitely needed help. Taking a deep breath, Helen climbed the front steps and pressed the doorbell. She could hear footsteps approaching, and then the door opened to reveal a tall, thin man with tired eyes and rumpled clothing. He looked like he hadn't slept properly in weeks, and there was a weariness about him that spoke of someone carrying too much responsibility alone. "Yes?" he said, his voice cautious but not unfriendly. Helen smiled warmly, drawing on all her courage. "Hello, I'm Helen Miller. I live just a few streets over, and I was told you might need some help with cooking and childcare. I'm experienced with children and would be very interested in helping your family." Then the man's expression shifted from confusion to surprise, then to something that looked almost like relief. "Oh," he said, running a hand through his disheveled hair. Yes, we do need help. I'm Michael. Please come in." As Helen stepped across the threshold into the cluttered entryway, she had no idea that this simple introduction would mark the beginning of the most meaningful chapter of her later life. She couldn't know that in walking through this door, she was about to become not just an employee, but an essential part of a family that would come to love her as much as she would love them. The house around her told a story of struggle and loss, but Helen saw only possibility. She was ready to offer her skills, her patience, and her grandmother's heart to a family that desperately needed what she had to give. Michael stepped aside to let Helen into his home, and immediately she could see the full extent of the chaos that had become his daily reality. The living room looked like a tornado had swept through it. Toys were scattered across every surface. Dirty dishes sat on the coffee table, and clean laundry spilled from baskets that had been placed there days ago with good intentions but never put away. The smell of burned toast still lingered in the air from that morning's breakfast disaster. "I'm sorry about the mess," Michael said, his cheeks reddening with embarrassment. "I keep meaning to get everything organized, but between work and the kids, I barely have time to breathe. Every time I clean one room, the other two get destroyed?" Helen smiled kindly, recognizing the exhaustion in his voice. She had raised 2 children herself and remembered those overwhelming days when keeping up with housework felt impossible. "Please don't apologize," she said gently. "You're doing an incredible job under very difficult circumstances." From somewhere upstairs came the sound of arguing voices, followed by a loud thud and then crying. Michael closed his eyes and took a deep breath, the kind of breath that spoke of someone who had reached the end of their rope multiple times already that day. "That would be my children," he said with a tired smile. "Let me go get them so you can meet them properly." While Michael went upstairs, Helen took a moment to really look around the house. Despite the clutter and chaos, she could see that this had once been a warm, loving home. Family photos still decorated the walls, showing happier times when a beautiful woman with kind eyes had been part of this family's story. Fresh flowers sat wilting in a vase on the kitchen counter, probably placed there with good intentions, but forgotten in the daily struggle to survive. The kitchen told its own story of a man trying his best but failing to keep up. The sink overflowed With dishes, the stovetop was splattered with food from multiple failed cooking attempts, and the refrigerator was covered with grocery lists, school notices, and children's artwork that had been hastily taped up. Empty pizza boxes sat stacked near the trash can, evidence of too many nights when takeout had been the only option. Michael returned a few minutes later, holding the hand of a small boy with tear-streaked cheeks and tousled brown hair. Behind them came a girl who looked to be about 7, her long dark hair hanging like a curtain around her face as she stared at the ground. "This is my son Danny," Michael said, gently pushing the boy forward. "He's 4 years old. And this is my daughter, Lucy. She's 7. Helen knelt down to be at eye level with the children, her heart immediately going out to them. Danny clutched a stuffed dinosaur against his chest and peered at her with curious but wary eyes. Lucy remained hidden behind her father's leg, refusing to look up or acknowledge Helen's presence. "Hello, Danny," Helen said softly. "What a beautiful dinosaur you have there. Does he have a name?" Danny's grip on the toy tightened, but after a moment he whispered, "Rex. He's a T-Rex and he's really strong." "I bet he is," Helen replied with genuine interest. "I've always thought dinosaurs were fascinating creatures." She turned her attention to Lucy, who was still hiding behind Michael. "And hello to you too, Lucy. I love your pretty hair." Lucy said nothing, but Helen noticed her peek up for just a split second before looking away again. Michael ran his hand through Lucy's hair with obvious affection, but Helen could see the worry in his eyes. "Lucy's been having a hard time lately," he explained quietly. "She used to be very talkative, but since her mother died, she barely speaks at all. And Danny, well, he's been acting out quite a bit." As if to prove his father's point, Danny suddenly threw his dinosaur across the room and crossed his arms defiantly. "I don't want to meet anyone new," he shouted. "I want Mommy to come back." Michael's shoulders sagged, and Helen could see how these outbursts wore on him every single day. "Danny, we've talked about this," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Mommy can't come back, but that doesn't mean we stop loving her. I don't care." Danny screamed, his little face turning red. "I want Mommy. She made good pancakes. She didn't burn them like Daddy does." Helen's heart broke watching this little boy struggle with emotions too big for his young mind to process. She had seen her own children go through difficult phases, but losing a parent was something entirely different. These children weren't just being difficult, they were grieving. "You know what, Danny?" Helen said calmly, still kneeling at his level. "I bet your mommy made the most wonderful pancakes. Would you like to tell me about them?" Danny stopped mid-tantrum, surprised by her response. Most adults tried to change the subject when he talked about his mother, but this lady seemed genuinely interested. "She made them shaped like Mickey Mouse," he said, his voice still shaky but no longer shouting. "And she put chocolate chips in them sometimes." "That sounds absolutely delicious," Helen said warmly. "Your mommy must have loved you very much to make such special pancakes." For the first time since Helen had arrived, Lucy looked up from behind her father's leg. Her eyes were large and sad, but there was a flicker of interest there. Michael watched this interaction with amazement. In just a few minutes, Helen had managed to calm Danny's tantrum and even get Lucy to show some engagement. He had been dealing with daily meltdowns for months, feeling more helpless each day as his children's behavior became increasingly difficult to manage. "Would you like to see the kitchen?" Michael asked, leading Helen toward the back of the house. "I should probably warn you, I'm not much of a cook. We've been living on frozen dinners and takeout mostly." The kitchen was even worse than Helen had imagined from her quick glance earlier. Every surface was covered with dirty dishes, empty food containers, and various items that had no clear home. The stovetop looked like it hadn't been properly cleaned in weeks, and the floor was sticky under her feet. "I used to be able to keep up with everything when ... Michael's voice trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "My wife Rachel was the one who managed the household. She was so good at all of this. The cooking, the cleaning, keeping the kids on schedule. I was just the guy who went to work and came home. Now I'm trying to do everything and I'm failing at most of it." Helen could hear the guilt and self-blame in his voice, emotions she recognized from her own experience of loss. After her husband died, she had felt inadequate at managing things he had always handled, like finances and home repairs. "You're not failing," she said firmly. "You're keeping your family together during the most difficult time imaginable." "That's not failing, that's heroic." Danny had followed them into the kitchen and was now pulling on Helen's skirt. "Lady, are you going to stay and make us dinner?" he asked hopefully. Helen looked at Michael, who was watching her with an expression that mixed hope and desperation. She could see how much this family needed help, not just with cooking and cleaning, but with healing and learning to be a family again without the person who had been their anchor. "If your daddy would like me to, I'd be very happy to make you dinner," Helen said, already mentally planning a simple but nutritious meal she could prepare with whatever ingredients were available. The relief on Michael's face was immediate and profound, as if someone had just thrown him a lifeline when he was drowning. Helen's first week at the house proved to be more challenging than she had expected, but not in the way she had imagined. She had prepared herself for dirty dishes and messy rooms, but she hadn't fully prepared for the depth of pain these children were carrying. Every day brought new surprises, new outbursts, and new heartbreaking moments that reminded her just how much this family was struggling. On her second day, Helen arrived to find Danny sitting on the kitchen floor, screaming at the top of his lungs because his father had given him the wrong cereal bowl. It wasn't just any tantrum, it was the kind of desperate crying that came from a place much deeper than breakfast preferences. "He's been like this for 20 minutes, Michael said helplessly, standing over his son with dark circles under his eyes. "I tried everything. I offered him different bowls, different cereal, even ice cream for breakfast. Nothing works anymore." Helen watched Danny carefully, noticing that he was clutching a small pink bowl with flowers on it. She had seen that bowl in the sink the day before and had washed it along with the other dishes. "Danny," she said gently, sitting down on the floor beside him, "is that Mommy's special bowl?" The crying stopped immediately. Danny looked at her with wide, tear-filled eyes and nodded slowly. "She always gave me cereal in this bowl," he whispered. "Daddy doesn't know. He gives me the blue one, but this is the one Mommy used." Michael's face crumpled as he realized what had been happening. He had been trying so hard to maintain routines and keep life normal that he hadn't noticed these small but crucial details that mattered so much to his children. Helen spent the next hour helping Danny understand that it was okay to use his mother's bowl and that wanting to feel close to her was perfectly normal. She also gently suggested that they could tell Daddy about special things like this, so he could help keep Mommy's memory alive in their daily routines. Lucy presented a different kind of challenge. She followed Helen around the house like a silent shadow, never speaking but always watching. When Helen tried to engage her in conversation, Lucy would simply stare at her with those big, sad eyes and then walk away. On the third day, Helen found Lucy sitting in her bedroom, surrounded by dozens of drawings. Every single picture was covered in dark scribbles, black crayon layered so thick that the paper was almost worn through in places. "Those are very interesting pictures," Helen said, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. "Would you like to tell me about them?" Lucy shook her head but didn't move away, which Helen took as a small victory. "You know, when I was little and felt sad, I used to draw pictures too," Helen continued. "Sometimes I drew dark pictures when I felt dark inside." "That's okay, feelings don't have to be pretty all the time." For the first time since Helen had met her, Lucy spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, but the words were clear. The dark ate up all the colors. Helen's heart nearly broke at the simple, profound way this 7-year-old had described her grief. Sometimes it feels that way, doesn't it? Like the dark is so big that it covers everything else? Lucy nodded, and Helen noticed a single tear rolling down her cheek. "But you know what I've learned?" Helen said softly. "The colors are still there, even when we can't see them. They're just hiding behind the dark for a while." The cooking situation was almost as challenging as the emotional one. Helen quickly discovered that both children had become extremely picky eaters since their mother's death. Danny would only eat food that was perfectly round, chicken nuggets, crackers, cookies. If something had corners or wasn't the right shape, he would push the plate away and refuse to touch it. Lucy had developed an intense fear of trying anything new. She would only eat plain white bread, applesauce, and occasionally some cheese. Any attempt to introduce vegetables or different foods would send her into a panic, convinced that new foods might hurt her somehow. "I don't understand what happened," Michael confided to Helen one evening after another difficult dinner. "They used to eat everything?" Rachel was always so proud of how adventurous they were with food. "Now I can barely get them to eat anything at all." Helen had seen this before in her own children during times of stress, though never to this extreme. She understood that when children's worlds feel completely out of control, they try to control whatever they can, and food is often one of the few things they feel they have power over. She started small, incredibly small. Instead of trying to introduce new foods, she focused on making the foods they would eat more appealing and nutritious. She found ways to hide vegetables in Danny's beloved round foods, blending carrots into his chicken nuggets and spinach into his crackers. For Lucy, she started by simply changing the color of the applesauce, adding a tiny bit of strawberry to make it pink. "Why is it pink?" Lucy asked suspiciously on the first day Helen tried this. "I thought you might like a pretty color," Helen replied casually. "But if you don't want to try it, that's okay too." Lucy stared at the pink applesauce for a full 5 minutes before taking the tiniest possible taste. When she didn't immediately get sick or die, as her anxiety-driven imagination had convinced her would happen, she took another small bite. The bedtime routines were perhaps the most heartbreaking part of Helen's days. Both children had developed fears about going to sleep, worried that something terrible might happen while they weren't awake to prevent it. Danny had nightmares almost every night, waking up screaming for his mother. Lucy would lie awake for hours, too scared to close her eyes. Helen began staying later each evening, helping Michael with the bedtime routine that had become a nightly battle. She discovered that Lucy responded well to very specific, predictable patterns. If they read the same book in the same chair with the same blanket every night, Lucy felt safer. Any change to the routine would cause her anxiety to spike. Danny needed something different. He needed to talk about his fears before he could sleep. Helen would sit beside his bed and let him tell her about his nightmares, about how scared he was that Daddy might disappear too, about how much he missed his mother's goodnight songs. "Can you sing Mommy's song?" he asked one night, looking up at Helen with hopeful eyes. Helen's throat tightened. She didn't know Rachel's songs couldn't replace that specific comfort, but she could offer something new. "I don't know Mommy's songs," she said honestly, "but I know some gentle songs that might help you feel peaceful. Would you like me to try one?" Danny nodded, and Helen began humming a soft lullaby her own mother had sung to her decades ago. It wasn't the same as what he had lost, but it was something warm and caring, and sometimes that was enough. As the week progressed, Helen noticed small changes. Danny's tantrums became slightly shorter, though they didn't disappear entirely. Lucy began to hover closer when Helen was cooking, watching everything she did with intense curiosity. Michael started coming home to the smell of real food, cooking and children who weren't in the middle of complete meltdowns, but the real breakthrough came on Friday evening. Helen was cleaning up after dinner when she heard Lucy's voice from the living room, not the whispered few words she occasionally spoke, but actual conversation. "Daddy, can Helen teach me how to make the pink applesauce?" Michael looked over at Helen with amazement and gratitude that brought tears to both their eyes. It was such a small thing, really. Just a little girl asking to learn something new. But after a week of watching these children struggle with the most basic aspects of daily life, it felt like a miracle. By the second month, something beautiful had started to happen in the house on Oak Street, though it happened so gradually that no one really noticed at first. Helen found herself arriving earlier each morning and staying later each evening. Not because anyone asked her to, but because leaving felt wrong somehow. The children had started to depend on her presence, and she had started to depend on theirs. It began with small things. Danny would run to the window every morning around 8:30, watching for Helen to walk up the front path. When he spotted her, he would shout, "Miss Helen is here! Miss Helen is here!" and race to unlock the door before his father could stop him. The excitement in his voice made Helen's heart sing in a way she hadn't felt since her own children were small, Lucy's. Changes were quieter but just as meaningful. She had started leaving small gifts for Helen, a carefully folded piece of paper with a smiley face drawn in yellow crayon, a pretty rock she had found in the backyard, once even a dandelion picked from the front yard that she presented with the seriousness of someone offering a rare diamond. "This is for you," Lucy would whisper, placing her gifts on the kitchen counter where Helen would be sure to find them. Helen treasured each offering, understanding that for a child who had lost so much, giving gifts was an act of incredible bravery and trust. The morning routines had transformed completely. What used to be chaos, Michael rushing around trying to find clean clothes while the children cried about everything from wrong socks to missing toys, had become something that actually resembled a functional family morning. Helen would arrive to find coffee already brewing. Because Michael had started setting up the coffee maker the night before, knowing Helen would appreciate a warm cup when she walked in. She would help get the children dressed, pack their lunches, and make sure backpacks had all the necessary homework and permission slips. "I don't know how you do it," Michael said one morning, watching Helen calmly braid Lucy's hair while simultaneously checking that Danny had brushed his teeth. "You make it look so easy." "It's not easy," Helen replied, securing Lucy's braid with a colorful hair tie. "But it's easier when you're not doing it alone." The afternoons had become Helen's favorite time. After school, both children would burst through the front door with stories about their day. Danny would chatter nonstop about playground adventures and art projects while Lucy would quietly show Helen her schoolwork, beaming with pride when Helen praised her efforts. Helen had started helping with homework, something that had been a nightly battle before her arrival. Lucy struggled with reading and her confidence had been shattered by months of grief and distraction. Helen worked with her patiently, never showing frustration when Lucy needed to sound out the same word multiple times. "I'm stupid," Lucy announced one afternoon after struggling with a particularly difficult sentence. "That's not true," Helen said firmly. "Your brain is just carrying a lot of heavy feelings right now, and that makes it harder to think about other things. But you're getting stronger every day." Danny had his own challenges. His teacher had called Michael several times about behavioral problems. Danny would get upset over small things and have dramatic meltdowns in the middle of class. Helen started practicing calm-down techniques with him at home, teaching him to take deep breaths and count to 10 when he felt overwhelmed. "When you feel the big feelings coming," Helen would tell him, "remember that feelings are like storms. They feel huge and scary, but they always pass." The evenings were when Helen felt most needed and most at home. Michael would arrive from work to find dinner simmering on the stove, homework completed and put away, and children who were tired but not hysterical. The house still wasn't perfect. There were still toys scattered around and occasional arguments between siblings, but it felt like a home again. Instead of a survival shelter, Helen had quietly taken over more responsibilities. She scheduled doctor appointments when the children were sick, remembered when permission slips needed to be returned, and even started coordinating playdates with other families from school. Lucy had made a friend named Katie, and Helen arranged for them to have their first playdate since her mother's death. "Are you sure Katie will want to play with me?" Lucy asked nervously the morning of the playdate. "Why wouldn't she?" Helen asked, though she knew exactly what Lucy was worried about. "Because I'm different now," Lucy said quietly. "Because I don't have a mommy anymore." Helen knelt down and took Lucy's hands in hers. "Sweetheart, you're still the same wonderful girl you always were. Having sad things happen to us doesn't make us broken or different in a bad way. It just means we've been through something hard." The playdate was a success. Helen watched through the kitchen window as Lucy and Katie played in the backyard, and for the first time in months she heard Lucy laugh, really laugh, the kind of full-belly giggling that children do when they forget to be sad for a little. While Michael had started looking forward to coming home in a way he hadn't since his wife died. Instead of dreading the evening chaos, he found himself wondering what Helen had cooked for dinner. whether the children had learned anything new and how their days had gone. "You know," he said to Helen one evening as they cleaned up after dinner together, "I think this is the first time in months that I've seen Lucy smile at the dinner table." Helen looked over at Lucy, who was showing Danny how to make shapes with her mashed potatoes, both children giggling at their creations. "She's finding her way back to herself," Helen said softly. "Children are amazingly resilient. They just need to feel safe enough to heal." But it wasn't just the children who were healing. Helen had started to feel like herself again too, in ways she hadn't even realized she had lost. The loneliness that had become her constant companion since her husband's death was fading. She had purpose again, people who needed her, and a reason to get up excited each morning. She had started buying small treats for the children when she went grocery shopping, their favorite crackers, a new box of crayons, stickers for Lucy's growing collection. She found herself thinking about them when she wasn't with them, wondering how Danny's show-and-tell presentation went or whether Lucy remembered to turn in her library book. The breakthrough moment came on a rainy Thursday evening. Helen was reading bedtime stories, something that had become part of their routine, when Danny suddenly climbed onto her lap and snuggled against her chest. "Miss Helen?" he said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "Yes, sweetheart." "I love you." The words hung in the air, simple and profound. Helen felt tears prick her eyes as she hugged him closer. "I love you too, Danny, very much." Lucy, who had been sitting beside them listening to the story, scooted closer and leaned against Helen's arm. "Do you love me too?" she whispered, so quietly Helen almost didn't hear her. "Oh, sweetheart, yes. I love you both so very much." Later that evening, after the children were asleep, Michael found Helen sitting in the kitchen, staring thoughtfully out the window. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. Helen smiled, but there was something bittersweet in her expression. "I was just thinking about how attached I've become to them. To all of you, really. I hope that's okay." "Okay?" Michael looked surprised. "Helen, you've become family to us. I can't imagine our lives without you anymore." The word family settled into Helen's heart like a warm embrace, filling spaces she hadn't even realized were empty. 3 months into what had started as a simple cooking arrangement, everything changed in a single phone call. Michael had been having trouble sleeping for weeks, staying up late worrying about budget cuts at his company. The tech industry had been volatile lately, and rumors of layoffs had been circulating through his office like wildfire. The call came on a Tuesday morning while Helen was helping Lucy with her breakfast. Michael's phone rang just as he was getting ready to leave for work, and Helen watched his face go pale as he listened to whoever was on the other end. "I understand," he said quietly into the phone. "Yes, I'll come in early today. Thank you for the heads up." When he hung up, his hands were shaking slightly. Helen had seen that look before. It was the same expression her husband had worn when he'd first received his cancer diagnosis, the look of someone whose world had just shifted beneath their feet. "What is it?" Helen asked gently, moving Lucy out of earshot. "My boss wants to see me first thing this morning," Michael said, running his hands through his hair. "The company is announcing major layoffs today. 20% of the workforce. I could lose my job, Helen." The weight of that possibility settled over both of them like a heavy blanket. Helen knew exactly what Michael was thinking because she could see it written all over his face. If he lost his job, he wouldn't be able to pay her anymore. And if he couldn't pay her, she would have to leave. The children would lose another important person in their lives just when they were finally starting to heal. "Let's not panic yet," Helen said, though her own heart was racing. "Go to work, find out what's happening. We'll deal with whatever comes next." Michael was already spiraling into worst-case scenarios. "If I lose my job, I'll have to find something else quickly, which means even longer hours. I might have to take a pay cut. I won't be able to afford childcare, let alone." He gestured helplessly around the kitchen, unable to finish the sentence. Helen understood. He wouldn't be able to afford her. That day dragged on forever. Helen tried to keep things normal for the children, but Lucy was particularly sensitive to emotional undercurrents, and she kept asking if something was wrong. "Daddy seems sad this morning," Lucy observed while they were working on her reading homework. "Sometimes grown-ups have worries about work," Helen explained carefully. "But that doesn't mean anything bad is going to happen to you." Danny, meanwhile, was having one of his difficult days. Without the stability of his father's calm presence that morning, he seemed to sense that something was off. He refused to eat lunch, threw a tantrum about getting dressed, and kept asking when Daddy was coming home. "I want Daddy," he cried for the third time that afternoon. "Why isn't Daddy here?" Helen picked him up and held him close, feeling his little body shake with anxiety that he couldn't even name. "Daddy had to stay at work a little longer today, but he'll be home soon," she promised, hoping it was true. The afternoon seemed to stretch on endlessly. Helen found herself checking the clock every few minutes, wondering what was happening at Michael's office. She tried to keep busy with normal activities, laundry, tidying up, preparing dinner, but her mind kept wandering to all the things that could go wrong. What would happen to these children if Michael lost his job and she had to leave? They had just started to feel secure again, just started to trust that the adults in their lives would stay. Danny still had nightmares about people disappearing, and Lucy was only beginning to come out of her shell. Losing another caregiver could set them back months, maybe years, and what would happen to her? Helen tried not to think about it, but the truth was that this job had become much more than income for her. These children had given her purpose and joy that she hadn't felt since her husband died. Going back to her empty apartment to days, with no one to care for and no one who needed her, felt almost unbearable. Michael finally came home at nearly 8 o'clock, long after the children's usual dinner time. Helen had fed them and was helping Danny with a puzzle when they heard his key in the front door. "Daddy!" both children shouted, running to greet him, but instead of his usual tired smile, Michael looked completely exhausted. He hugged the children mechanically, his mind clearly elsewhere. "Hey guys," he said absently. "Did you have a good day with Miss Helen?" Helen could see the stress written in every line of his body. After the children went to bed, she approached him carefully. "How did it go?" she asked, though she was almost afraid to hear the answer. Michael collapsed into a chair at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands. "I still have a job," he said finally, "but barely. They cut my entire department in half. I'm now doing the work of 3 people, and they made it very clear that if I can't handle the increased workload, there are plenty of people who would be happy to take my place." Helen felt relief and worry at the same time. "So you're not being laid off?" "No, but I might as well be," Michael said bitterly. "They want me to work 50, 60 hours a week minimum. Weekend work will be regular. And they cut everyone's salary by 15%, effective immediately." The implications hit Helen like a physical blow. Michael would be gone even more than before, leaving her essentially raising the children alone. And with his reduced salary, he might not be able to afford to keep paying her. "Helen," Michael said quietly, and she could hear the pain in his voice. "I don't know if I can afford to keep you on. The pay cut, combined with the increased hours, I'm going to have to figure out something else for childcare." There it was. The words they had both been dreading. "I understand," Helen said, though. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "No, you don't understand," Michael said, looking up at her with desperate eyes. "You don't understand how impossible this is. Those kids need you. I need you. You're not just our employee anymore, Helen. You're family. But I can't ask you to keep working for less money when you could find a better situation somewhere else." Helen sat down across from him, her mind racing. She thought about her empty apartment, her small pension, her lonely days before she had found this family. Then she thought about Danny's morning hugs, Lucy's shy smiles, the way both children had started to heal under her care. What if we made a different arrangement? She heard herself saying. Michael looked at her questioningly. "What if instead of paying me a regular salary, you just covered my basic expenses? My rent, groceries, things like that? It would probably cost you less than what you're paying me now." "Helen, I can't ask you to take a pay cut like that," Michael protested. "You're not asking," Helen said firmly. "I'm offering." "Michael, these children have become like grandchildren to me. You've become like family. I'm not going anywhere unless you want me to go. For a moment, Michael just stared at her, and Helen could see tears gathering in his eyes. Are you sure? He asked finally. Because once things stabilize, once I figure out this new job situation, I want to make this right. I want to pay you what you deserve. I'm sure, Helen said, and as she spoke the words, she realized she had never been more certain of anything in her life. That night, as Helen tucked Danny into bed, he looked up at her with worried eyes. Miss Helen, are you going to go away like Mommy did? Helen's heart broke at the question, but her voice was steady when she answered, No, sweetheart. I'm staying right here with you. As autumn turned into winter, Helen's sacrifice began to show its true weight. The reduced payment arrangement meant she was living on barely enough to cover her basic needs, but something unexpected was happening. She was happier than she had been in years. The irony wasn't lost on her that having less money had somehow made her feel richer in all the ways that truly mattered. Michael's new work schedule was brutal. He left the house before 7 in the morning and rarely returned before 9 at night. Weekends that used to be family time were now filled with catch-up work and video calls. Helen watched him grow thinner and more exhausted each week, but she also saw his relief every morning when he knew she would be there to take care of everything he couldn't. The children had adapted to their father's absence during the day, but bedtimes had become particularly difficult. Danny would ask every night when Daddy was coming home, and Lucy had started having anxiety attacks when Michael's work calls ran late into the evening. Where's Daddy? Danny would ask, standing at the living room window in his pajamas, watching for headlights that wouldn't appear for hours. Daddy's working hard to take care of our family, Helen would explain patiently. But he'll be home to give you a kiss goodnight, even if you're already sleeping. It was during one of these long, difficult evenings that Helen realized how completely her old life had disappeared. She was no longer just helping out a few hours a day. She was essentially living at the house, going home only to sleep and collect mail. The children depended on her for everything their father used to do, and she found herself making decisions that felt more like parenting than caregiving. When Lucy's teacher called about behavioral problems at school, it was Helen who went to the parent conference. When Danny fell off his bike and needed stitches, it was Helen who sat in the emergency room holding his hand while they waited for Michael to drive across town from his office. Are you his grandmother? The nurse had asked, watching Helen stroke Danny's hair as the doctor cleaned his cut. Helen paused, unsure how to explain their relationship. I'm his family, the nurse smiled knowingly. That's all that matters. But it was during Thanksgiving week that everything came to a head. Helen's own adult children, Robert and Patricia, came to visit for the first time since she had started working for Michael's family. They were shocked by what they found. Mom, you look exhausted, Patricia said bluntly as they sat in Helen's small apartment on Thursday evening. And when did you get so thin? Are you eating enough? Helen realized. She had been so focused on making sure Danny and Lucy ate well that she often forgot about her own meals. She had also been walking more than usual, hurrying between her apartment and Michael's house, running errands for the family, chasing after active children. I'm fine, she insisted, but even she could hear how unconvincing it sounded. Robert, who worked as an accountant, was more direct. Mom, Patricia told me about this job arrangement you have. You're essentially working full-time for part-time pay. This family is taking advantage of you. They are not, Helen said firmly, feeling defensive of Michael and the children. They're struggling, and I'm helping. It's what family does for each other. But they're not family, Mom, Patricia said gently. They're your employers. And employers shouldn't ask their workers to sacrifice their own well-being. Helen found herself getting angry, which surprised her. You don't understand. These children need me. Their father is doing everything he can to keep his job and support his family. I'm not being taken advantage of. I'm choosing to help people I care about. At what cost? Robert asked. You're working yourself to death for people who aren't even related to you. What happens when you get sick? What happens when you can't work anymore? Do you think they'll take care of you? The questions hit Helen harder than she expected. She had been so focused on day-to-day survival and the children's immediate needs that she hadn't thought much about her own future. That night, she lay awake thinking about her children's words. Were they right? Was she being foolish? But then she thought about Danny's face that morning when she had helped him with his math homework. How proud he had been when he finally understood fractions. She thought about Lucy, who had started bringing friends home from school again, who had begun drawing pictures with bright colors instead of dark scribbles. The next morning, Helen arrived at Michael's house to find him in the kitchen, looking more defeated than she had ever seen him. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately. "I got called into another meeting yesterday," he said without looking up from his coffee. "They're talking about requiring even more weekend work. I already barely see my kids. If this keeps up, I might as well not live here at all." Helen could see he was at his breaking point. The man who had been holding everything together through sheer determination was finally cracking under the pressure. "Michael," she said carefully, "my children were here yesterday, and they raised some concerns about our arrangement." Michael's head snapped up, alarm in his eyes. "What kind of concerns?" "They think you're asking too much of me. They think I'm working too hard for too little pay." Helen watched all the color drain from Michael's face. "Oh God, Helen, they're right, aren't they? I've been so desperate to keep everything together that I didn't stop to think about what I was asking of you." "You didn't ask," Helen reminded him. "I offered." "But that doesn't make it right," Michael said miserably. "You're practically raising my children while I'm never here, and I'm paying you less than I used to. Your kids are absolutely right to be concerned." They sat in silence for a moment, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Helen spoke. "The question isn't whether your children or mine are right about the arrangement," she said slowly. "The question is whether this is working for all of us." Michael looked at her questioningly. "Is it working for you, having me here so much?" Helen asked. "Helen, you've saved us," Michael said without hesitation. "I don't know how we would have survived these past few months without you, but I can't keep asking you to sacrifice so much." "And it's working for the children," Helen continued. "They're healing, they're stable, they feel secure. But is it working for you?" Michael asked quietly. Helen thought about the question seriously. Was it working for her? She was tired, yes. She was working harder than she had in years. She was living on less money than she needed. But she was also needed, valued, loved. She had purpose and meaning in her life again. "My children are worried about my future," she said finally. "They want to know what happens to me if something goes wrong, if you don't need me anymore, if I get sick." Michael nodded slowly. "Those are fair concerns, and I don't have good answers for them. But here's what I know," Helen continued. "For the first time since my husband died, I'm not lonely. For the first time in years, I wake up excited about my day. Yes, I'm tired sometimes. Yes, the money is tight. But I love these children like they're my own grandchildren, and I love being part of this family." "Even when that family is barely holding itself together?" Michael asked with a sad smile. "Especially then," Helen said firmly. "That's when families need each other most." That evening, as Helen tucked the children into bed, Lucy asked her a question that would stay with her for days. "Miss Helen, are you happy living with us?" "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "My friend Katie's grandma lives with them, and Katie says sometimes her grandma gets sad because she misses her own house. Do you miss your house?" Helen looked down at this thoughtful little girl and realized that somewhere along the way she had stopped thinking of Michael's house as a place she worked and started thinking of it as home. The weeks leading up to Christmas brought an unexpected turning point that no one saw coming. Michael had been working late one evening when his phone rang with a call that would change everything. His sister Claire was on the other end, calling from across the country where she lived with her own family. "Michael, I've been thinking about you and the kids constantly," Claire said without preamble. "Tom got a promotion, and we've been talking about what we could do to help. We want to fly out for Christmas, but more than that, we want to make you an offer." Michael stepped away from his laptop, grateful for any distraction from the endless stream of emails and reports that had become his evening routine. What kind of offer? He asked, settling into the chair where Helen usually sat to help the children with homework. We want to help you financially, Claire said bluntly. Not a loan? A gift? Tom and I have been doing well, and we have more than we need. We know you're struggling since Rachel died, and we know you've been working yourself to death trying to keep everything together. Michael felt his throat tighten. Pride had kept him from asking for help, even from family, but the truth was that he was drowning. Between the mortgage, childcare costs, groceries, and all the other expenses of raising 2 children alone, his reduced salary barely covered the basics. Claire, I can't ask you to do that, he started to say. You're not asking, she interrupted, echoing the same words Helen had used months earlier. We're offering, we've already decided. The only question is whether you'll let us help. But the conversation took an even more unexpected turn when Claire continued. There's something else, Michael. We've been talking about Helen. Michael's attention sharpened immediately. What about Helen? From everything you've told me over these months, it sounds like she's become much more than an employee. It sounds like she's become family. And if that's true, then maybe it's time to make it official. What do you mean, official? Claire took a deep breath before continuing. What if Helen moved in permanently, not as hired help, but as family? What if you offered her the guest room as her permanent home, and instead of paying her a salary, you just took care of her needs? Housing, food, medical expenses, everything. She could be like a live-in grandmother to the kids. The idea hit Michael like a bolt of lightning. It was so simple, and yet so profound, that he wondered why he hadn't thought of it himself. But what if she doesn't want that? Michael asked. What if she feels like I'm trying to take advantage of her? Only one way to find out, Claire said gently. Ask her. After hanging up with his sister, Michael sat in the quiet house for a long time, thinking. Helen had already sacrificed so much for his family. She had given up her comfortable routine, her independence, even her financial security to help them heal. But what if, instead of asking her to sacrifice more, he could offer her something that would benefit everyone? The next morning, Michael woke up before his alarm, his mind racing with possibilities. He found Helen in the kitchen, as always, preparing breakfast and packing lunches with the efficient grace that had become so familiar. Good morning, she said, handing him his coffee in the mug she had bought specifically for him weeks ago. You're up early. I couldn't sleep, Michael admitted. Helen, can we talk tonight, after the kids go to bed? There's something important I want to discuss with you. Helen felt a flutter of anxiety. Important conversations in her experience usually meant bad news. Of course, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Is everything all right? I think it might be better than all right, Michael said with a smile that confused and intrigued her. The day seemed to drag on forever. Helen found herself distracted during story time with Lucy, and she burned the first batch of cookies she was making with Danny. The children noticed her preoccupation. Are you okay, Miss Helen? Danny asked, looking up at her with concerned eyes as she started over with a new batch of cookie dough. I'm fine, sweetheart, she said, ruffling his hair. Just thinking about grown-up things. Are you thinking about going away? Lucy asked quietly from where she sat at the kitchen table. Coloring. The question startled Helen. Why would you ask that? Because last time a grown-up said they needed to talk about something important. Mommy went away to the hospital and never came back. Lucy explained with the matter-of-fact way children sometimes discuss their deepest fears. Helen's heart broke at the reminder of how much trauma these children had already experienced. She knelt down beside Lucy's chair and took her small hands. Lucy, sweetheart, I'm not going anywhere. Sometimes grown-ups need to talk about good things too, like planning birthday parties or thinking about what to have for dinner next week. Lucy nodded, but Helen could see the worry still lingering in her eyes. That evening, after the children were finally asleep, Helen and Michael sat at the kitchen table with cups of tea, the house quiet around them. Helen's hands trembled slightly as she waited for Michael to speak. Helen, Michael began, I talked to my sister yesterday, and she made me realize something important. Helen braced herself for whatever was coming. She made me realize that somewhere along the way, you stopped being our employee and became our Family. And if you're family, then maybe it's time we treated you like family instead of asking you to sacrifice for us. Helen looked at him with confusion. I don't understand. Michael took a deep breath. What if you moved in here permanently? Not as hired help, but as family. What if the guest room became your room, and instead of worrying about paying you a salary that I can barely afford, I just took care of all your needs? Your housing, your food, your medical expenses, everything. Helen stared at him in shock. Michael, I couldn't possibly ... Let me finish, he said gently. You've already given up so much for us. You're barely getting by financially, you're working harder than anyone should have to work, and you're doing it all because you love these children. But what if instead of you sacrificing for us, we could take care of each other? Helen felt tears starting to gather in her eyes. But what about your privacy, your independence? Having an old woman living in your house permanently? Michael smiled. Helen, you're already here more than you're at your own apartment. The kids. Think of you as their grandmother. I think of you as, well, as the mother figure they desperately need and the family support I never knew I needed. But what would people think? Helen asked, though even as she said it, she realized she didn't really care what people thought. I think people would see a family that found each other when they needed it most, Michael said softly. Helen, those kids love you like you're their real grandmother. And honestly, I've come to depend on you not just for childcare, but for advice, for support, for the feeling that I'm not doing this alone anymore. Helen was quiet for a long moment, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was offering. It wasn't just a place to live, it was belonging, security, family. The guest room has that big window that faces the garden, she said finally, and Michael knew from her tone that she was seriously considering it. It does, he agreed. And there's plenty of space for your furniture, your books, your photos. And I could finally have a real vegetable garden, Helen continued, thinking out loud. The children could help me plant it in the spring. They would love that, Michael said. Hope growing in his voice, Helen looked around the kitchen that had become as familiar to her as her own. She thought about going back to her empty apartment every night, about the loneliness that waited for her there, about the uncertainty of her future. Then she thought about Danny's morning hugs, Lucy's shy smiles, the family dinners around this table, the bedtime stories and scraped knee kisses and all the small moments that had filled her life with joy again. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'd like that very much. Moving day came on a sunny Saturday in January, and it felt more like a celebration than a relocation. Helen had been gradually bringing her belongings over for weeks, but today was special. Today she was officially moving home. The children had been planning for this day like it was Christmas morning, and their excitement was infectious. Grandma Helen, can we help carry your books? Danny asked, bouncing on his toes as Helen unpacked a box in what was now officially her bedroom. Somewhere along the way, the children had started calling her Grandma Helen, and the title had stuck so naturally that even Michael used it now. Of course, sweetheart, Helen said, handing him a small stack of paperback novels, but be very careful. Some of these books are older than your daddy. Lucy appeared in the doorway carrying Helen's jewelry box with the concentration of someone handling precious treasure. Where should this go, Grandma Helen? Right on the dresser would be perfect, Helen said, watching as Lucy carefully placed the wooden box exactly in the center of the surface. Thank you, darling. The guest room had been transformed over the past few weeks. Michael had insisted on buying Helen a new mattress, and the children had helped pick out cheerful yellow curtains that let in the morning sunlight. Helen's favorite armchair sat by the window, positioned perfectly for reading or watching the children play in the backyard. Family photos lined the dresser, pictures of her late husband, her own children, and new ones of Danny and Lucy that she had taken over the past few months. It looks like you've always lived here, Michael said. From the doorway, holding a cup of coffee and watching the organized chaos of Helen settling in. It feels like I have, Helen replied, and she meant it. The room didn't feel foreign or temporary. It felt like home in a way her apartment hadn't in years. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Helen's daughter, Patricia, arrived unannounced. and Helen could tell from her expression that she was still struggling with the new living arrangement. "Mom, can we talk privately?" Patricia asked, casting meaningful glances toward the children who were showing off their newly organized playroom to Helen. They stepped out onto the back porch, where Helen could still keep an eye on Danny and Lucy through the window. "I'm worried about you," Patricia said without preamble. "This whole situation feels complicated. What happens if Michael gets married again? What happens if he decides he doesn't need you anymore? You've given up your apartment, Mom? You've made yourself completely dependent on this family?" Helen had been expecting this conversation. Her children meant well, but they didn't understand what her life had been like before she found this family, and they couldn't see what it had become. "Patricia," Helen said gently, "when your father died, I thought my life was over. I thought the best parts of being me, being needed, being useful, being loved, were gone forever. I was just existing, waiting for time to pass." Patricia's expression softened slightly, but her concern remained. "These children brought me back to life," Helen continued. "They gave me purpose and joy and a reason to wake up excited every morning. Yes, there are no guarantees, but there are no guarantees about anything in life. What I know for certain is that right now, today, I'm exactly where I belong. But what about your future? Your security?" Helen smiled, looking through the window at Lucy, who was carefully arranging her dollhouse furniture while explaining the setup to Danny. "My security isn't in a bank account or a lease agreement," Helen said. "My security is in being loved and needed by people who have become my family. Michael isn't just providing me with room and board, he's giving me a place in his family. That's worth more than any salary." That evening, as they all sat around the dinner table together, Helen realized how completely their life had transformed. Michael was actually home for dinner, his work stress having eased considerably since his sister's financial help had relieved some of the pressure. The children were chattering about their day, secure in the knowledge that both their father and their beloved Grandma Helen would be there when they woke up tomorrow. "Grandma Helen," Lucy said during dessert. "Jenny at school asked if you're really our grandma or just pretend our grandma." Helen felt her heart skip a beat. "What did you tell her?" "I told her you're our real grandma," Lucy said matter-of-factly. "Because real means you love someone and take care of them and never leave them. And that's what you do." Helen had to excuse herself to the kitchen to compose herself. The simple wisdom of a 7-year-old had just perfectly defined what family really meant. Spring brought new joys and confirmations that this arrangement was exactly right for everyone. Helen planted the vegetable garden she had dreamed about with Danny and Lucy as her eager assistants. They planted tomatoes, carrots, lettuce, and even a small patch of strawberries that the children checked obsessively every day for signs of growth. "When will they be ready to eat?" Danny asked for the 100th time, crouching beside the tiny green strawberry plants. "Patience, my little farmer," Helen laughed. "Good things take time to grow." Michael's work situation had stabilized, and he was able to spend more time at home, but Helen's role in the family hadn't diminished. If anything, it had evolved into something richer and more complex. She wasn't just providing childcare anymore. She was a full partner in raising the children, making family decisions, and creating the kind of stable, loving home that all three of them needed. The school year brought its own confirmation of how well this arrangement was working. Lucy's teacher requested a conference, and Helen attended alongside Michael, both of them recognized as Lucy's guardians. "I wanted to meet with you both to tell you how remarkable Lucy's progress has been," Mrs. Thompson said, smiling warmly at them. When she started the school year, she was withdrawn, anxious, and struggling academically. The transformation has been incredible. She's confident now, she participates in class discussions, and her reading level has improved dramatically. "What do you think made the difference?" Michael asked, though Helen suspected they both knew the answer. "Stability," Mrs. Thompson said simply. "Children thrive when they feel secure and loved. Whatever you're doing at home, keep doing it." Walking out of the school together, Michael took Helen's arm. "You know, when I hired you to cook a few meals, I never imagined we'd end up here." "Where's here?" Helen asked, though she was smiling. Here is having a partner in raising my children. Here is having someone who loves them as much as I do. Here is having a family again when I thought that part of my life was over. Helen squeezed his arm. For me, here is having grandchildren to spoil and worry about. Here is having a son who trusts me with the most important job in the world. Here is having a purpose that makes every day meaningful. That night, as Helen tucked Danny into his bed, he looked up at her with sleepy eyes. Grandma Helen, are you happy you came to live with us? Oh, sweetheart, Helen said, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. I am happier than I ever thought. I could be again. Good, Danny said with satisfaction. Because we're never letting you leave, Helen laughed softly. I wouldn't dream of it. As she turned off his light and closed his door, Helen reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. She had knocked on a stranger's door looking for work, lonely and struggling and unsure of her future. She had found something infinitely more valuable than employment. She had found her family dot in the quiet hallway, surrounded by the gentle sounds of a house full of people she loved. Helen knew with absolute certainty that sometimes the most beautiful families are the ones that choose each other.